JP, welcome to Conversations That Matter, especially this stream that we're doing around the understanding UNDRIP and its role in moving us towards reconciliation in Canada. What exactly is the association that you represent?
It is an incredible organization that's been around for 37 years. It's a bridge. It really is a bridge. We have Indigenous and non-Indigenous businesses that come together, and our job as an association is to create the space for them to work in a space where they can build economy together. And we do that through our programs, our events. We've got the best research in the world on Indigenous economy because leadership, whether you're private sector or government, you want to make sure you have the great data to make the decisions, whether policy decisions or business decisions to advance. And the association prides itself in building trust and relationships.
Isn't that in many ways at the core of what UNDRIP is about?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point. When we think about, listening to a lot of the speakers, we hear it's a path, it's a journey, it's coming to the table to work together because, I don't suspect all the Europeans are going to get, and you heard this before, get on the boats and go back home. So we're here, they're on Turtle Island, so we got to figure out this relationship. And it's been fractured for so long. And, Indigenous people have battled for our rights for a long time, and it's just year after year, we've just been going forward. And I think governments and industry that dig their heels in just prolong the inevitable and create harsh environments through harsh relationships. And I think if we took a step back and went, we've got children we both want to look after, and we've got, an economy that we need to build together. We've got an environment that we also need to respect and make sure that it's protected to the best of our extent possible and using the best technologies and sustainable. So UNDRIP is that space, that pathway that we come together to try and figure this out.
Right. As you're speaking, I'm thinking about the fact that there are some people who go, well, if you win, I lose. But I don't see it that way.
Neither do I.
You win, I win, we all win. All boats rise with a high tide. And so this concept of segregation rooted in the thinking of the day, which we can now look at it and go, it was severely misguided. How does UNDRIP help us overcome the legacy of that past? Because it's not a good past.
No, it's been a horrific past. And I think going back to the principles of building relationships, trying to rebuild trust, because everything forms from trust. If you can't trust each other, you're never going to advance anything. Different thinking will hopefully translate to different actions, because as you and I know, and everybody knows, you do the same things, you think the same way, things aren't going to change. And so we look at the infrastructure, and I'm talking about the political infrastructure and the environment around us. If we have people that all look the same, they're going to think the same. Right. They're going to act the same. And there's so many incredible Indigenous leaders, from health practitioners to business leaders to politicians. They are all converging into a space now, and UNDRIP is that vehicle to come together to think differently. We look different, and that's okay. Can we have a respectful relationship? And can we rebuild the trust that we once had as nations? I think that's fundamentally going to be key, that we need to feel that there is a safe place for us to come together to have respectful conversations. And the wonderful thing is we're not all going to agree. And I say that's wonderful because if we all agreed, that groupthink, which has gotten to us where we are today, or at least an imposed groupthink from dominant governments, we're never going to get anywhere. Right. So divergence of views is absolutely fundamental in strengthening us. But at the same time, we can't get to a place, and it's been named the word veto throughout this morning a number of times. And many of us leaders don't look at UNDRIP as veto. It is, a place to actually work out our differences and build on the strengths. Okay,
so if we take a look at the, I guess the language of the Silcoteen decision laid out by former Supreme Court Chief Justice Beverly McLachlin, there is a provision in there by which she indicated that if the Crown can establish that the greater good of all within the region has to be met, well, then the Crown still has the authority to do that. And I don't see anything in UNDRIP that overrides that ruling from the Supreme Court Justice. Do you see it that way?
I see it, again, going back to the relationships. Because we all have different views, we have different socioeconomic backgrounds. For the benefit of all, if you just start to describe what the benefits look like, one community to another, it's going to look differently. And as an example, if we put 50 people in this room right here to decide on what color to paint the walls, and if we had to have full consensus,
well, we'd never get it painted.
We would never get it painted.
Exactly.
And so the way that I'm looking at the benefit for all is defining what's important, what are our values. And, you're in a marriage, it's a marriage sometimes, you know, your spouse, there's give and take, there's compromise. You're never going to get everything you want, but it's limiting the compromise and making sure that you're part of a process.
Right.
And I think that's both the challenge and the opportunity.
Well, if we take a look at the challenge right now with the Coastal GasLink and the difference of opinion between the hereditary chiefs and the Wet'suwet'en and the elected council. Well, these are the kinds of dialogue, discourse, disagreement that happen in any community, and it has to get worked out. Somehow we have to figure out how do we build those relationships and paths to communication that allow us to figure that out. And why would it be any different within the First Nations community than it is anywhere else?
No, I agree. And we've had this conversation too around, okay, well, where do we draw the line? In this case, 20 First Nations are supporting it, and the elected council of the Wet'suwet'en are in agreement, and the hereditary chiefs are opposed. Where do we draw the line? Again, is that a veto? That's the big challenge. But I think, again, if you look at from what I understand, talking to some of the elected folks and some of the people around today, is that a vast majority, maybe vast is maybe a little bit gratuitous, but the majority of people in the community are supportive. So
how is that different than, let's say, one of the municipalities or cities along the Trans Mountain Pipeline being in favor of it, but the city of Burnaby is opposed to it?
Yeah. I think, the Premier Horgan, just recently, and I just read the article this morning, and due process and consultation and everything, and respectful relationships between Coastal GasLink and the communities, a lot of that has been done. And a lot of it has been settled, and a lot of it has been put into a direction. And, that's the process. And the Premier has made a very strong stance. And not everybody, and again, to your earlier comments about the Silcoteen case and Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin on the benefit for all, sometimes people aren't going to win as much as they want. I guess that's the end of the day.
Right. But, here we are. To the credit of the BC government, they have said we are going to adopt the principles as laid out in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And we recognize that it's going to have some hiccups along the way. It comes down to what you were talking about earlier. We have to build relationships. We have to have those channels of communication. So when you look at UNDRIP, is it something that causes you concern? Or are you saying, no, we'll work our way through this because when we're motivated to do so, we can find the way?
I think you've just answered the question for me, because largely we've not had those spaces.
No, we haven't.
And now we've got this space to talk more deeply about these issues. And being silenced is not a correct path. And so now we've got this space. And again, being motivated to achieve something for the greater good, for the benefit of all, for as many people as we can, while managing environmental impacts, et cetera, is really important. But one thing I do want to touch on is that one of my favorite things to do when I was a forester is working with community up in Northern Ontario, looking at forest management plans. One of my favorite things was to work with the elders. We would pore over maps, talk about areas that were appropriate for development, areas that were not off limits, and we would work with the province. We'd work with the forestry company. If something came up, an area of concern, that's all we labeled it then. The community and the forestry company and the M&R would get together, and that was part of my job, to talk about how we're going to mitigate impacts. And that's a process to help us advance these tricky situations.
Right.
But the other thing is that we can't incorporate in my view, and many view, I think, our ways of knowledge, our ways, our seven generational thinking, our ecological knowledge into a Western science model. It doesn't work. So I think the opportunity as well is, and what UNDRIP does, I think, is that it helps flex the room around governance systems to incorporate an Indigenous worldview. Because if we're just taking our knowledge and our people and plunking it into a Western model, is that really embracing the richness of Indigenous people to have stronger outcomes? I would think not, although it's a great step. But I think UNDRIP as well, by recognizing it, pushes the boundaries a little bit in legislation to allow for Indigenous protocol, to allow for Indigenous governance systems and ways of thinking to come to stronger outcomes.
There is a cultural integration specialist by the name of Mafalda Arias. She's originally from Peru.
Amazing.
And she has worked to a great extent within the mining sector, helping people understand that you may be talking about the same things, but your language doesn't quite line up.
Yeah.
And she says, but you also have to understand what the weight of the word is. She said, so you talk to a non-Indigenous person who says, oh, well, yes, our responsibility is to look after the environment. And you talk to an Indigenous person who says, yes, our responsibility is to look after the environment. You think, good, we're on the same page. She says, that you have to go further in understanding. So there's more work. And she said, within a Western Canadian perspective, a non-Indigenous person would go, we're stewards of the environment. Whereas an Indigenous person would say, no, we're one with the environment. Mm-hmm. And so when you start to understand that, and then you can bring these elements together, then I think that you can create this basis of understanding that says, now we can work towards a common objective. And really, is that not what dialogue is about? Being able to define what is that common objective, and hopefully it's the betterment for all, well, then we can have great success.
I totally agree. I was in Toronto one time listening to, I don't remember. I remember it was actually Michael Crothers, the country chair for Shell, and there was an environmental leader at the front of the room. And the environmental leader he was great. And this has stuck with me. He said, you know what? He says, I'm sure Michael doesn't get up in the morning and figure out, first thing that comes to his mind is, like, how are we going to destroy the environment?
Right.
And I get up in the morning and the last thing I'm thinking about is how are we going to destroy jobs? Our jobs are to come together to figure out a pathway forward together so we can find some balance in all of this. And I'm a strong believer. I mean, you heard I think you might have heard my remarks. Like, my grandfather was a logger, my dad was a logger, my other grandfather was Trans-Canada Pipeline gas line worker in Northern Ontario. Tens of thousands of our people rely on the natural resource sector for our revenue to support our families and our communities.
Right.
Thousands of our businesses rely on the natural resource sector to provide for our families and our communities and the regions in the country. Mm-hmm. And we just can't. Without transition, without respectful dialogue, all these things I think that UNDRIP offers us to transition into a more sustainable future for all of us. And it's going to take some time, but without having us there helping make the decisions together, and I think that's why this is so important, it's together. Right. It's not outside of a process. And that's the beauty of UNDRIP and recognizing it.
And we'll build those relationships that will ensure that there is sustainability in this.
Right. Absolutely.
National Chief Perry Bellegarde points out, if you can't build relationships, you can't build anything.
That's right.
And I think that,
he says all the time, he says, before you build a business, build a relationship. Because if you build a business without a relationship, you got a faulty foundation.
Exactly. Yeah. And UNDRIP, I think, just reinforces the fact that that's what we have to do with everybody. It doesn't matter what your background is. I'm going to treat you with respect. We're going to figure out something that will work to our mutual benefit. And then let's move forward. And I think that we're on the cusp of being able to fully embrace that concept here in Canada.
Yeah, and we can't shy away from the difficult conversations. And events like today, this is where the difficult conversations are happening, in the front of the room, in the corners.
Oh, yeah.
And having everybody at the table. You look at the suite of people speaking, government, First Nations, industry. There's even lawyers here. Who knew? But these are tough conversations.
Well, yeah, because there's some people who are enthusiastic, others who are cautious, some are fearful, some are, even openly hostile.
Yeah.
Okay, but at least we're talking. And if that's the beginning, well, then let's fight our way through that and figure it out.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you.